Welcome and thank you for joining us on the 2020 webinar, Reimagining the Economy with Innovative Support. I'm Sherilyn Seeley, Program Manager for Grantmakers in the Arts. If you haven't already done so, please bring your attention to the poll located to the left of your screen. We'd like to kickstart this webinar with a true or false question. When we consider the economy, and specifically the arts economy, funders continue to solely practice project-based funding. However, although we see a shift in the philanthropic sector towards granting more GOS funding in the wake of COVID-19, is that enough for artists to thrive? But if funders are to support artists holistically beyond projects, how should funders be more strategic and forward-thinking? We're glad to address those questions and many others with presenters Jeffreen M. Executive Director of Threewalls, Angie Kim, President and CEO of the Center of Cultural Innovation, and Javier Torres, Program Director of Thriving Cultures at Surdna Foundation. Dr. Jeffreen is the Executive Director of Threewalls. She merges her administrative, curatorial, and academic practices into her cultural leadership of supporting artists and community development. As an advocate for racial inclusion, equity, and access, Hayes develops adaptable approaches for community participation, particularly those in underrepresented groups. Angie Kim is the President and CEO of the Center for Cultural Innovation, which is a conduit for resources to flow to individuals and the arts and incubating platform for generating new knowledge and innovative solutions. In 2019, CCI launched a new time-limited and national special initiative called Ambitious, which supports trailblazing projects aimed at alternative economic solutions to problems plaguing artists and the millions of other gig workers who share their conditions of low and unpredictable incomes, lack of worker protections, high amounts of debt, lack of assets, and thin credit files. F. Javier Torres serves as Program Director of the Thriving Cultures Program, overseeing a $9 million grant-making portfolio seeking to advance the Foundation's social justice mission. His career has been committed to building just and sustainable communities in partnership with artists and culture or tradition bearers, and now leads a program that invests in cultural strategies to deconstruct and eliminate racism in our communities. We're glad to have them joining us today. At the very end of the presentation, I'll be joining to facilitate a Q&A. And with that, I'll turn it over to our presenters. Welcome, Jeffreen, Angie, and Javier. Angie, why don't you get us started?
Thank you. Nice to be here. Thanks for having me. This is Angie. So I will respond a bit also to that question prompt in my remarks. Ambitious is time limited. It's national. We launched it a little over a year ago. We have 3 objectives, and they can also be considered our motivation for doing this work. The first is that, excuse me, that Ambitious is meant to incubate funding approaches to better get at systems level change. And the premise of that is our conventional grant-making tools that we use, which are primarily that of project-focused one-year grants to 501c3s, is just not robust enough or even adequate enough to do systems change work. And there's a number of reasons for that. One is that our methodologies were really informed at a time in the 1980s and the 1990s when our philanthropic sector was professionalized around contracting out behaviors. And so if you can consider funding for, to deliver X number of meals to a community, or funding to underwrite the cost to produce a new play, that is conducive to project funding and contracting out behavior. But for investing in people and ideas that are that need a lot of flexibility, project support or project restricted grant money, especially when it is time limited also, actually undercuts their ability to move flexibly in terms of responding to problems and stepping through doors of new opportunities. The second thing that marks our objective is that we act as a bridge to de-silo efforts and work in common cause with anyone and everyone who have shared objectives and values, because frankly the overall system of support for every sector, not just in the arts, are broken, and that's become much more visibly apparent because of this economic depression induced by COVID-19. And then the third objective is that we focus on upstream system-level solutions so that artists and arts workers have safety nets and the kinds of capital that would enable them to not only afford time, the health that they need, and the costs that they need to expend to pursue their artistic practice, but also to give them the kinds of protections, social insurance, safety nets, that would allow them to not suffer from the kind of financial precarity that can end up silencing their voices. So CCI continues to provide and be an advocate for providing one-off project support grants to artists. And we think that providing project support grants is still important to nonprofit arts organizations. But we also have to be cognizant that for many of us who have been doing this work for a long time, many also for decades at their foundations with their arts and culture portfolios, we are losing gains. Rising costs of living, gentrification and displacement, erosion of social insurance in the overall labor market, which includes healthcare access, affordable education, insulation from wage theft, the ability for people to save for rainy days, emergencies, and even retirement. It means that fewer artists are able to afford being an artist. Unless arts and culture philanthropic behavior shifts to also look at system-level issues that help level the playing field for everyone, we are actually contributing to a growing monoculture at a time of really exciting demographic change. Oh, I forgot, sorry. I have slides. So this is all the reasons why we started Ambitious. And here are the three things that Ambitious actually does. So we have two funding areas. The first is we provide funding to trailblazers of alternative economic systems and paradigms. And in this work, we are doubling down on providing support to people whose communities reflect those who have been the most harmed or marginalized by public support, nonprofit support, and for-profit financial institutional support systems. So these are folks who are in Black and Native American communities who are trying to own the means to their own financial institutions and funds in order to govern and circulate the money within their own communities. If there's one big takeaway I take from the COVID-19 CARES Act federal benefits, the way that they actually structured how you get access to those benefits, it really shows how ineffective it is for us to be relying on large corporate financial institutions that really have put people at community levels at the back of the line. Small business owners, freelance artists, all of those have had to compete to capture the attention of banks that frankly are not even located or at all interested in their own in those local communities. This is why there is a growing movement for what's called the new economy sector, which has been working for years on creating structural change to proliferate things like localized economies, publicly owned banks, community-based impact funds, and creating the kinds of systems and architecture that would allow people to move their investments from Wall Street, where they feel like they have very little benefits or even see not enough of the kinds of things that would benefit their own communities, moving it from Wall Street to moving their capital to Main Street so that they can invest in things that might be their local coffee shops or bookstores or nonprofit theater companies. The second thing that we invest in is we support artist ownership of assets so that artists can exert an influence in shaping these emerging economies, both in place-based ways and digitally based economies. One example of this is that we are providing support to a startup company called Crux. Surdna is also a supporter of them. Crux is a platform cooperative which basically means they are an online company where all the members are co-owners. It's a platform cooperative of and for Black XR creative content producers. And this is a really important example of why we need to be thinking outside of the typical 501c3 box, which is that there are relatively few opportunities for artists to own their creative assets in the digital economy. And the digital economy will continue to grow. We will increasingly find ourselves buying creative content that is produced for online distribution and use and circulation and digitally based consumer goods. So we need more companies, or to encourage artists to start companies that give artists an option, especially artists of color who have been crowded out of these digital spaces, an option to not just go work for Disney or Blizzard Media or Sony Pictures where they'll never own the rights to their own creative assets. We are also supporting, as an example of providing artists with ownership of their assets, is a company, well, it's not a company, there's a cooperative in the European Union called SMART, and we are providing funding for U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives here in the U.S. to basically beg, borrow, and steal that model and bring it to the United States. And what that model does, and it was actually built for artists, is it allows artists who are, or allows anyone at this point who are freelance laborers to join SMART as a member, which also confers them with employee status. And as an example here in the U.S., what that would mean is that if you are a muralist and you want to go work for a restaurant owner who wants you to paint a mural on their wall, the artist, as a member of this SMART platform cooperative, would have SMART issue a contract to that restaurant owner. And then when the muralist is done with the mural, they tell SMART, and SMART immediately issues that muralist their payment. So for that artist, there is no wage theft. Their income is guaranteed. And for that restaurant owner, if they decide not to pay up, in many offices in the EU, SMART is largely staffed by legal counsel, lawyers, who will go after people who are non-compliant. It has basically effectively eliminated the problem of wage theft among freelance workers to something like 4% when it used to be in the double-digit percentages, just like it is right now here in the U.S. So these are things that we can solve for today, and that we not only know that if we can solve it for artists, it will solve it for millions of others who face their similar conditions of gig and financially precarious work. And the third thing that we do tangibly is that we serve funders. We built this as an incubation arm for philanthropy. We understand how hard it is for funders who are largely siloed and have been restricted by their own guidelines to look beyond their sectors to understand what are both the problems at the system levels, but also what are the potential solutions. We spend, for ambitious staff, we spend a lot of our time outside of the arts. We talk and sit at tables with people who are doing universal basic income or providing cooperative models for domestic workers, or with people in fintech. I mean, the list is long. And we act as the pattern recognizer for foundations to understand this is what's happening. As an example, recently in California, the state enacted a law that came into effect January 1st, 2020, called AB 5, and it effectively looked at all freelance labor, many of whom are artists, as misclassified employees, basically making it illegal to be an independent worker under the desire to provide everyone with employer-conferred benefits, right? The impulse is a good one, but for many, many artists, that kind of law just doesn't work for them. Immediately, we saw and heard of small recording studios who basically decided that they were going to close up shop because they can't afford to put the hundreds of artists who come through their doors to press a soundtrack or a record. They can't afford to put them on payroll. We heard of nonprofit small theater companies who basically said we're going to take an entire season hiatus because we can't comply with this law at this moment. That was all happening before COVID-19 hit. So we have had a double whammy in our arts community. But because we had already been looking at labor issues, it allowed someone like the folks at Hewlett Foundation, who are part of Ambitious, to look to us and say, we're not sure, but what are the other solutions? Because all we've been seeing is artists fighting unions, and that's not exactly what we think is the most effective long term, and we agreed. So we have a contract with the Urban Institute that just got inked this week for us to take a look at what are new or alternative models to provide support systems for people like artists, to use this lens of what it looks like for artists' lives as a way to intersect into an ongoing discussion and debate about how we need to refresh our social contract to protect American workers. I'll just conclude by saying that Ambitious, I wish we and many of us had actually started this kind of incubation and broader systems change work a decade ago. But that's not the reality. But I am glad that we were already up and running before COVID-19 struck. And I will say that we were designed to work best at disrupted moments. We started this initiative because we already saw that right now we are in a moment of change. And we actually need to be doing more to make sure that the lives of artists are improved coming out of this moment of change because of a significant demographic shifts, which is going to change what our cultural identity in America can and should look like. Generational attitudinal differences, technological disruptions, a racialized wealth gap that is growing ever more so because of COVID-19. Because we are all about pattern recognizing for solutions, we do also see that there are clear answers to how we can actually inform and influence a new normal. And because our portfolio of work looks so broad, what I can just leave you with is that when it comes to what we do and how we work, I would say that our lens is to look at everything through the lives of artists, their financially precarious lives. And to ask, like, if it can work for artists, can it work for millions of others? Our rudder, which shapes all of our decision-making, is to enact ownership and financial independence of beneficiaries, not to create charitable dependency. And then our North Star is to basically be supporting a culturally inflected economic paradigm. There's a lot of talk and a lot of work right now around shifting away from profit-only capitalism. But without actually having a lens of, like, for whose culture do new economic paradigms work for, we're worried that the solutions will continue to be academically driven and technocratic and still leave people we care about behind. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Angie. I think I am up. This is Javier. And I just want to start by saying a big thank you to GIA for helping to organize this conversation. I'm really excited for you all to get to hear about CCI and Threewalls' work as important partners in Surdna's portfolio. And really excited to see a lot of old friends on this webinar and some new folks and board members from Surdna that have joined us for today's conversation. And I hope that everyone is staying safe and healthy in these extraordinary times that we're living in. The Surdna Foundation is a 102-year-old family foundation, and we are committed to building just and sustainable communities of all kinds. And I apologize, and for some reason my window just got rid of the presentation slides. There we go. We are trying to build just and sustainable communities that are characterized by sustainable environments, inclusive economies, and thriving cultures. Our refined strategy, which the board approved in 2018, is really rooted in radical imagination. And I've had so many folks come to me and ask me why we would use a word like radical in describing the strategy or our approach philanthropically. And one of the things that we wrote into our strategy paper that we shared with the board and we've shared with our communities is that when you go to the root of the meaning of the word radical, it just means to deal with the root cause of an issue in whatever you are attempting to redress or to invest in. So our work is really focused on holistically supporting our partners and believing that if we really holistically support the human in the organizations that are regranting our dollars and partnering with frontline communities, that they can take those same values and approaches in the way in which they work on the front lines. So we're going to take a little time to talk about the Thriving Culture Strategy. I am not going to go deeply into this, but really want to talk at a high level about this sort of theory of change document, which is wonky and has lots of different colors. But I'm going to focus on the first two layers of colored shapes. Our strategy has some important underlying assumptions. We recognize that we're living in a time of great injustice, and that there's important work that's happening to resist the injustice that's taking place, that's removing our civil rights and continuing to marginalize communities of color, people with disabilities, and other folks that are in marginalized communities. With that in mind, I typically use the metaphor that as a person who grew up in a coastal community, I remember coming together with neighbors to fill sandbags to keep water out of the basements of people in our neighborhood when tides were rising because of a storm. But what we believe is that we are in a time of not just a rising tide of injustice, but a series of tidal waves. And that at least from Surdna's unique perspective, what we can contribute is a worldview that recognizes there's no amount of sandbags that we're going to fill that's going to keep this water out of our homes. And that there weren't a lot of funders that were thinking really critically about how we cultivate the conditions for individuals and communities to be clear about the infrastructure we want to build for the future that will not carry forward the racial injustice that exists in our society and has been part of the DNA of the U.S. since the formal founding of this country and Western contact, but that can also withstand future tidal waves of injustice. So as we really break our 8 funding initiatives into 3 strategic approaches called Create, Clarify, and Connect. And while they're presented here in this diagram as 3 even, circles, sometimes we think about them as concentric circles. And at the center are our Create initiatives that are focused on really getting dollars into the hands of artists of color to work with their communities and to imagine and practice racially just systems and structures in public space in real time. And then we have some follow-on approaches and interventions under our Clarify initiatives that are focused on taking some of the most compelling ideas that artists come up with their communities and translating them into knowledge products that can be distributed and disseminated for broader consumption and consideration. Finally, the funding initiatives under our Connect approaches are focused on creating the pathways for those artists, for those community members and their research partners to connect with private industry and elected and appointed officials to really see where the rubber hits the road and how we can begin to enact the structural change that communities and culture bearers and artists have envisioned and practiced. We do this in a couple of ways. I'm going to talk about at the center of our strategy, our relationships with 11 regranting partnerships, of which Threewalls in Chicago is one. We provided general program support to each of these grantees and to ask them and took really careful attention at their budget to say, are they providing benefits to all of their staff, even when they are part-time? What does it look like to encourage a grantee to really cost out how expensive it is to care for the humans behind their work? There are times where organizations are at a variety of scales and may not be ready to take on full-time staff because there isn't enough work and they're making sure that they have the financial reserves for long-term sustainability. And we say that's fine, but even if you're not ready to take on the full-time staff, there are ways to cost out benefits that allow people to take vacations, that allow people to pay off debt, that allow people to save, to purchase a home, or to pay for education, and to make sure that they have a retirement account. And we are making sure to have these deep conversations with our grantees so that they're really reimagining their organizational structure and beginning to develop and flex the muscle of in fact asking philanthropy for the full cost of the work. What's great is that our regranting partners are then turning around and taking the resources that we've provided them and doing the same with the individual artists and artist collectives to whom they will be redistributing those dollars. And the way that we're doing this is, as we've co-designed budget forms for each of those 11 organizations across the country, is that we've required that a minimum of 12% of any artist project budget request include additional resources for real human costs. So in this case, I want to agree with Angie and to the sort of initial prompt when you joined this webinar. One-year project support is antithetical to the structural change that we're all considering. And I want to recognize that philanthropy is a generations-old institution that not all of us will be able to pivot as quickly as we would like to providing everybody with general operating support. And in some cases where we're looking for discrete outcomes, that may not be the most strategic lever. So I want to talk about how we're looking at holistic project support as an alternative to that. This work then really is for the regranters to be having deep conversations with their applicants to think about and acknowledge that vacations are in fact not a luxury, despite the fact that in this moment in our society, it's really only salaried individuals that are provided with that kind of benefit. When I think about the importance of people that are fighting injustice on the front lines, being able to not burn the candle at both ends and to think about what it means to travel, be inspired, rest, breathe, take care of ourselves, because the work that we're doing is generational. And we're not going to change our society in one day, so we need to take care of the human beings that are behind this work. And that's just a practical example of how we're hoping to do that. We really take this theme across all of the 8 funding initiatives within Thriving Culture's program support, where in some cases we are providing general operating support to some of our partners, and in other cases it's program or project support, but in each conversation we're really diving deep into the financials to understand the psychology behind the intentions and to try and undo some of the negative impacts that we in philanthropy have really generated by nickel and diming organizations and thinking that the only measure of success is in fact how we get the most dollars out the door, without considering the negative impacts that end up taking place on the staff, the real human beings that are doing this work every day, and how do we look at equitable holistic support at each level, even when we're working with intermediaries. So I'm going to stop there and hand it over to Jeffreen, who's going to have a lot more amazing details to share about her work and her leadership at Threewalls, and look forward to engaging in Q&A once we're all done.
Good afternoon.
That sounds great, Jeffreen.
So I'm Jeffreen. Great. So I'm Jeffreen Hayes. I am the executive director of Threewalls, and Threewalls is a Chicago-based community arts organization, and we are centering artists as humans and thinking about how artists engage in their respective communities while the organization serves as kind of a bridge between the two. So our mission is to foster contemporary art practices that respond to lived experiences, encouraging connections beyond art. And this is a shift for the organization. We're about to be 17 years old, and initially were founded to support artists directly in terms of residency programs, offering artists their first solo exhibition, and kind of focusing on artists who were not necessarily making art for the market to be sold, but also as a way to build community amongst artists in Chicago. And over time, the organization kind of was a bricks and mortar gallery presenting art exhibitions in addition to programs, publishing. And in 2015, the board kind of decided it was time to engage artists who were underrepresented and marginalized in our community, and wanting to shift how do we extend the level of support to these groups of artists, particularly in Chicago, where Black and brown artists or Black and brown communities actually make up the majority of the population in the city. And so what moved from a bricks and mortar kind of traditional exhibition making, it moved from that to, well, how do we support artists? Where is it that they need the most support? And in many conversations with artists locally, also nationally, what kept coming up to, what kept rising was supporting their ideas, their research ideas, not necessarily the making of an object, but their ideas. And so this is kind of where the part of our mission where it says respond to lived experiences comes into play, because a lot of the artists, their research was directly connected to their lived experiences, whether it's gentrification, whether it's identity, whether it is thinking about economies. That's where we saw as an organization we could really uplift the voices and the work of Black and brown artists in a way that is not typically done. So this is also where kind of our values come into play. And I love that there's been a conversation so far about shared values and values, because we can have the mission, but our values really drive home what that is. And so our values of celebrating difference, thinking about collaboration, encouraging risk, and respect for process. And these were all really important when thinking about artists who are not always represented in large, more visible arts organizations. And so in thinking about the artist and not the output or the object, and thinking about their research and their process, and we are very driven by the process. So for us, it's not that important that the outcome be this perfect thing, but really, what is that process that artists go through? How can we support their ideas and the development of those ideas as a thought partner? What we also learned in many conversations with artists was that they were really desiring a relationship with curators, not to, well, give me this opportunity, but really to work through ideas and have those conversations. And you know, we're in a city where we've got one of the largest art schools in the country, and what happens when you graduate from that environment where you are having these regular conversations with your professors and your colleagues, and now you're working out on your own. This is a space where we get to kind of extend that and do it in a collaborative way, not to dictate what the outcome is going to be, but really to understand how to help the artists move forward. And so this is where one of our programs, Rad Lab, and Outside the Walls Fellowship kind of came to be. And it's a program that's now 3 years old. And the first couple of years, it was going to artists, having conversations about what they're thinking about, what's the big idea, which is one of the questions that we ask all of the artists that we want to work with. What's the big idea? What's the project that you want to do that you couldn't do otherwise if you had adequate support. And then we continue that conversation, invite them in to research that idea over a year. And so Rad Lab Outside the Walls, the fellowship is a 2-year program where the first year the artists are exploring that idea. And we really leave research up to them. We don't dictate what that looks like. We do, though, in the effort to expand access to artists and the arts in our city, we do require the artists to do 4 public engagements in their neighborhoods. And so this is not only a way to provide access to arts programming and artists, but also to get the artists to kind of understand that they are part of a community and not just in a community. And what's been really wonderful about this is that those who are really great at engagement do really well. And those who have not had as much experience, they get that experience. And we help them along the way in thinking about, well, how do you take this very kind of cerebral idea that is related to your community and distill that to the public? How do you talk about this? And so that's the first year. There are public engagements, and they take place in the artist neighborhood. So they're not taking place at the Threewalls office. They are in the neighborhood, and they tend to be in spaces that are community identified spaces. So they can be the libraries, they can be, they could even take place at the train stop, the parks, condominium buildings. We're really looking to bridge that gap in terms of where art can happen in these public spaces that aren't necessarily always deemed such by the local municipalities. So after that first year, and we are supporting that research directly with funding, and the artists can use that funding for whatever they need in terms of their research as well as their lives. And so some of them are going to archives, some of them are traveling, some are getting really necessary equipment like a new laptop. Again, we don't dictate how that money can be used as long as the research is taking place. Then going into the second year of the fellowship, which is called Outside the Walls, that second year is helping the artists kind of present that research into a public installation or exhibition. And again, the public presentation takes place in their community in a public space that is not an art space, and that we make very clear, because we want to think about, well, where can art live? Again, that's not always deemed a public space by local or state officials, but in the community. And so on showing three of the projects that we supported last year that took place in different spaces. Libraries are very popular, and so we had 2 projects that were in a library, and then we also had a billboard project. And over the time of that installation, the artists also present public programming, again, kind of germane to the rhythm of their community, their neighborhood, and it's a way to continue to build that relationship and also bridge the gap. And what we have found in this approach is that residents really love the fact that art is happening in their neighborhood and that they don't have to go downtown or to the Loop to experience art. We've also found that in supporting projects in community, we also encourage the artists to hire and spend some of their funds in that community so that it stays within that community. And we have found that there's just also this wonder, which is also kind of underlying this project, is to elicit wonder again when it comes to art, when it comes to culture, stumbling upon something that is in your neighborhood but also is in conversation with. The other part of this work that's really important to us is to acknowledge that we are not bringing art to a community, but that it's already within that community. So the artists are contributing to a culture that they are already a part of. And in this, really thinking also holistically about the artist as a human. How do we support their needs that also go beyond the art making? And I'm going to end there.
Thank you so much. Those presentations were fantastic. A few points that I definitely want to make sure to call out. Angie, in your presentation, you talked about folks shifting their investments from Wall Street to Main Street, and I thought that was really compelling. And if all of you can look to the left of your screen in the notes category, you'll see the link to the organization that Andrew was referring to in your presentation in the EU. So go ahead and click the link and check it out. And we're also very excited. Oh, can folks hear me? Okay. Also very excited to hear what the outcome is of the Urban Institute research on the support for independent workers with the lens towards individual artists and cultural workers. So thank you for that. Love the definition you offered, Javier, on radical, just really dealing with root causes and root issues. And great. I think it's great, too, that you guys are looking at 12% of budget requests, including accounting for human costs, like resting, for example, because, you can't pour from an empty cup. Right, and so it's critical to include that when we're thinking about holistic support. And Dr. Jeffreen, awesome discussion about the Rad Lab Fellowship. You guys are doing really great work, and it's awesome that the fellows are being able to install their projects in spaces that, public spaces that typically wouldn't have that art. So I think that's awesome. And so with that, it's time for us to transition into Q&A, and we've already got some questions from our guests, so I will jump right to that. So this is kind of a question for all three of you, if you can all three offer your thoughts. So the first question is, how do you, if you do, see operating models changing during and post-COVID-19?
Whose operating models? Are you talking about 501c3 grant-seeking business models? Are you talking about as a sector?
Yeah, I think
operating models?
I think you can speak to any, just kind of the way that either your foundation, your organization, just the way that we operate as a sector. Like, how do we see things changing? We already see things changing right now during COVID-19, of course, with just the way that funds are allocated, switching to GEO support, reporting deadlines being removed and things like that. But what are some other things, just kind of keeping in mind more holistic support and some of the recommendations and strategies that you talked about with Ambitious?
I'm going to echo something that Jeffreen said, which is I think the ideally the new normal, not just because of COVID-19, but generally is to shift our focus from just the objet d'art, which is still a valid thing to be supporting, but to recognize that that comes at a human cost. Like there are people making the work that we see on the stage, on a proscenium stage, or on the exhibition gallery wall, and we have relied as a sector on other systems of support to ensure that artists have a chance to get their work on a gallery wall, but those systems are clearly broken. So we, Javier also said this too, we actually need to be thinking about like, what are the human needs that people have, that artists and arts workers have?
That's great. Thank you.
I might jump in, Sherilyn, to say, one of the conversations that we've been having inside of Surdna and with the board is really thinking about some of the tenets of trust-based philanthropy that have existed for some time, but many of us have been resistant to really trusting our partners, building deep human relationships, and allowing people to evolve over time. And so you're seeing some immediate adjustments in response to COVID of just getting dollars out the door to support people in keeping payroll, getting money into the hands of individuals who are trying to pay rent and buy food. And I really think that as a field, we need to consider which one of these sort of new tactics that we seem to be more comfortable with during a time of pandemic or of trauma are we going to be comfortable with continuing on when we have found a vaccine or a test that allows us to really return to public life and think about how the system of philanthropy really relies more on trust and relationships and less on some level of order and control that's defined by long narratives and complex financial documents.
Thank you for that. Jeffreen, did you want to add anything before we continue? All right. Jeffreen?
Oh, sorry. No.
Okay. Okay. No problem. So I actually want to sort of go back to the last note that you made, Javier, and sort of segue into sort of a larger question that all three of you can respond to. Thank you for sharing that link, Steve. So just kind of generally, when we think about centering a lot of voices, the future of equity, and realizing an economy where artists are truly valued holistically, as you just mentioned, we don't really have an option in terms of how we function. We have to be radical in how we fund. And so what is the first step in offering equitable and holistic support to communities that deals with root causes? And, previously we all talked about folks often are looking for a technical response, but sometimes it's kind of like a mindset or frame of thinking. So what are your thoughts on that? What can you offer? And this is for all three of you.
As a staff member of a family foundation, I'll say we really had to start with conversations with our board and our trustees and building an understanding of what their hopes and dreams were, what their priority areas were, and how we could share a fundamental shift in approach. Sometimes we talked about it in the context of how we already treat staff and how do we carry those values out into the work that we're doing in grant making. And in other cases, we looked at partner foundations and the way in which they use trust-based philanthropy approaches to sort of illuminate effective practices that we might be able to test. One of the pieces that has been effective, at least for the Thriving Cultures program at Surdna, is that we largely framed the strategy with our board as an R&D strategy. It was research and development, and it allowed us to make clear that we expected a lot of what folks might traditionally call failure, within quotes, in the work, because it's about prototyping and testing and equitably resourcing folks to, as Jeffreen referenced, develop their ideas over time and get paid for that real sort of intellectual capital development, and thinking about how we build in frameworks for ongoing learning that can strengthen, improve future work that we do and future work that our artistic partners do.
Great. And then Jeffreen, did you want to add anything?
Yes. So for us and the work that we do, it really had this, like Javier talked about, the board and leadership. We had to start with our board, and it's not enough to say you want to do it, but having folks really take stock of themselves. So it becomes this internal process. And what we've learned over the years is that if you don't actually practice it within your own personal and professional life, you can't actually support this work. It becomes lip service. And so I would say the first step really is doing a self-assessment on where your biases live, and be open and honest about that.
That's great. And one of the folks who is attending the webinar mentioned the importance of trust in this whole process, and I wanted to highlight that because it's something that we constantly talk about. So another question, this one is actually directed towards you, Jeffreen, but any of you can really answer. How can funders work with arts organizations to advocate for a living wage for artists and creatives, exploding the narrative of the starving artist to one of treating artists as professionals? And we've kind of talked about this throughout the webinar, but if you have anything further to add, that'd be great.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very big question that I've really been thinking a lot about. And I think part of it becomes what we've been talking about through the webinar, is kind of moving away from productivity to really thinking and treating artists as humans. I think I feel like it's a blessing and a curse in terms that artists and creatives absolutely offer different ways of thinking. They offer different solutions to our problems, but we don't necessarily recognize that they are also tasked or faced with the same issues that we're asking them to solve, and so kind of not necessarily treating them as human. And so what would it look like for funders to work with arts organizations that are treating artists as humans and supporting them in that way? And I think I would say at Threewalls we are one step closer to that, I think, through the fellowship program, in that the budget does require artists to provide a line item for their for living.
That's great and essential. Javier, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think that our partnership, as I mentioned earlier, is about relationships first. One of the things that we did once the board had approved our strategy in 2018 is that we took a year where we provided what we called planning grants to over 40 organizations that could potentially have been strong partners aligned with the implementation of our new strategy. And pardon the crass nature of this characterization, but we almost said, can we just date each other for a year and figure out how our systems work, and how do we pay people to actually get to know us, as opposed to having this power dynamic where if people want access to our resources, they just have to allocate time to writing a compelling narrative and budget, or making the case, or networking so that the relationships are and connections are made to effectively get resources from a foundation. For us, we sort of opened up and we asked for recommendations and suggestions. we made those planning grants and just paid people general operating support and said, we're going to ask you to come to a couple of meetings and share your intellectual capital and use these dollars to account for your travel and for the reality that if we were asking executive directors to join us in our boardroom or on webinars, that's time away from their busy schedules. So we were allocating dollars for them to say, well, how might you pay a part-time staff member extra hours to do the work you can't do while you're talking to us? Or bolster your development team if you're normally the primary development staff member at your organization so that you can be present and not working until 2 in the morning because we took your full day in the boardroom. And so those are some of the strategies that we've deployed of really realizing that we have to fund on the front end, we have to fund equitably all the way through, and then we also have to think about what our closing strategy is for the transition of our strategy in the same year where we made a lot of general operating support for getting to know folks. We also provided anybody who from the previous strategy the same amount of money that they were previously receiving for 1 more year so that we could, again, continue to get to know them and determine whether they were aligned with the forward-looking strategy that the board had offered us.
That's awesome. That is like real solid relationship building, and I commend you and Surdna for that. Angie, I actually want to kick a question over to you just about new economy work, just because, you know, when we talk about alternative ways of funding, we hear these days a lot of the term often alternative economies. But you specifically make a point to say new economies. So is there a moment or something that made you realize that you wanted to shift to new economy work?
No. We are agnostic. We're going to go where the solutions are. It's not just good enough to have like a great idea or a great project. We're looking at what does it look like for our entire portfolio to be sustaining and influencing the building of a new architecture. There's a lot of different terms that people use, and they are using these terms very intentionally. So I'm not trying to disrespect anyone by kind of collapsing them all for our purposes, but people are working in what's called the new economy movement. There's also restorative economy, solidarity economy. If you're in the environmental sector, there's also just transitions. We are agnostic about which subsector you're in and much more interested in who's actually providing solutions that we're trying to weave together. I will also say that we definitely agree with what Javier is doing in terms of moving at the speed of trust, which actually makes us move faster. But we also will make grants to those whom we don't have any relationship with, just based on the basis of what our grantees, whom we've vetted and built relationships with, tell us is important for them to get their own work done and to build their federated network nationally. And so we'll go where they suggest we go and not even spend a lot of time, honestly, on due diligence and relationship building, knowing that these are people who are seminal to the overall building of a new system.
That's great. And I think it goes back to trust and letting your grantees drive the work. So thank you for that. I have 2 more questions before we go, and these last 2 questions are for all of you. So first one, it comes from one of our attendees, and she writes that she loves the idea of artists being supported to make art in their communities, and that that kind of goes back to your presentation, Jeffreen. And so she says, I'm working in a city that has gentrified rapidly, so the artists are pushed out of their neighborhoods. Has that come up in Chicago? How are you approaching it? But if any of you can speak to that type of scenario, if you can.
I'll just jump in and say this is why I think systems change work is so important to think of it beyond our conventional behaviors. Being geographically restricted, which many localized funders do for good reason because they have loyalties to a particular community. If you have loyalties, I mean, I guess I'll give our example right now. We're about ready to have a relief fund with the support of a pooled fund of many, many foundations in the East Bay of California, Oakland, Alameda counties, Contra Costa counties. And there are funders who are completely 100% dedicated to Oakland artists. But because of gentrification and displacement, those artists now come into Oakland from other cities. And so we have been doing what we can to basically say, well, let's spread the dollars farther afield, because we want to acknowledge that just because you've left the city limits through no fault of your own, you cannot access these funds, thereby creating this kind of wall. So all of which is just to say it's an example of how if we really want to support an ecosystem, we actually need to be thinking more broadly about why do we have certain restrictions and to be as broad as possible. Again, if you're trying to support the production of a play in your neighborhood, that makes sense to have your geographic focus. But if you want to actually support an ecosystem or systems of support or all of those things, then it doesn't make sense to actually have such tight boundaries.
Great.
And I might add that in many cases, local funders, like public agencies or city arts and culture offices, are concerned about this similar question because they are so geographically focused. I think in some cases for us, the strategy has been twofold. We, for example, in our regranting partnerships, we have 3 cities that we're partnering with, including the city of Oakland, the city of Jackson, Mississippi, and the city of Boston, Massachusetts, and have partnered them with community-based organizations that serve as their fiscal sponsors and hold their purse strings, but allow for offices of arts and culture to really reimagine and change the way in which they're engaging with their communities. And some of the other equity work that's really focused on thinking about gentrification from a structural economic development lens has been through our partnership with the Government Alliance for Race Equity that has municipal partnerships across the country and is continuing to try and integrate cultural strategies with the embedding of racial justice values and systems inside of municipal and town local government.
Great. Jeffreen, did you want to add anything?
Yes. We are now beginning to deal with that issue. This particular program is in its 3rd year, and it's definitely come up as a question, as an issue with the current applicants of, well, I'm in this one neighborhood, I might have to move because of gentrification or what have you. And so we're having to to take that into consideration when thinking about communities, especially just given also Chicago's history with segregation and redlining. What then does that look like in terms of your community? But we also feel that if you start in one, if when you get the fellowship you're in one neighborhood and you end up moving to another, then how do you bridge between the 2 communities? So we're trying to be flexible. We have not yet gone to any deeper than the artist and kind of wanting to follow the artist's lead. But we definitely anticipate it becoming that much more of a problem in the city.
Okay. Well, thank you for sharing how you've done that. I want to acknowledge it is 3 minutes past the hour, so I know that folks might have to leave. I do want to ask one more question, as I mentioned, and this one's related to COVID-19. So this is our final question before we go, and this is for all 3 of you. So how has the COVID-19 crisis either affected your approach, or how might your approach have changed if you'd started your holistic and innovative support today?
I'll start off by saying that largely we've stayed committed to our approach because it's been so forward-looking and anticipating these kinds of disruptions in our society and thinking holistically. So there's not too much that we would change, and we're just fortunate, for example, that we've been able to augment our approach with additional emergency response resources that our board approved a number of weeks ago so that we can support those members of our portfolio who have lost earned revenue because of their inability to be able to present publicly. But beyond that, we're really grateful to have such strong partnership with the leadership of the foundation and the board to have had that kind of forward-looking, holistic approach that we believe is what we need to continue to do moving forward in this time of COVID-19.
Thank you.
For us, our approach hasn't changed. If anything, we're that much more committed to it because it is about supporting artists, and we are centering Alana artists. And so really what we are doing is kind of extending what that support looks like. And I think one of the beauties in the way that we work is that it is responsive. And so our approach is just that. And we're going to be following what the artist needs.
Great. Angie, did you want to add?
I'll just say, again, I think there's, you're going to get the same response because all three of us represent, like, we knew that these disruptive moments would happen. So our approach hasn't changed. But what I will add is that the funders who came into this pooled fund, Surdna Foundation, Hewlett Foundation, many others, for Ambitious's work, what they actually did was create bench strength in our entire sector by investing in CCI for this work. So when COVID-19 happened and when funders started to say we need to have some kind of relief fund for our communities, we had already built up knowledge about what does it look like in terms of labor practices to beget better economic resiliency. We had been asking those questions and looking at that information. We read economists' reports all the time about why we're in a zero growth economy, and it's all on the backs of people incurring debt. Because we had that information through Ambitious, when it came time for us to start listing these relief funds, we were able to make very strong recommendations about the design and the protocols for how these funds should behave. And we were very clear with all of our funders, and we're probably going to list at least 4 relief funds. Some are already up and running. But the point is that we were able to make really strong recommendations about we need to make normalize that these would be a priority consideration would go to people who have been historically vulnerable financially, and that it's not just first come, first serve, and that we were able to start to normalize also that support for nonprofit arts organizations, it's not just 501c3s, but also intentional communities of cooperatives and collectives and mutual aid societies, in which those are ways that artists are working now to collectivize their efforts, but they again fall outside of typical funders' radar. So all these things we have ingrained within our relief funding approaches, which to me reflects how, the return to the philanthropic and nonprofit sector because funders were, trusted us to be experimental and incubate new thinking and approaches.
That's great. Thank you for those responses, especially the ones that are related to COVID-19, just because I know a lot of folks are, including me and grant makers in the arts, are thinking about that and how we may or may not need to pivot and respond. So thank you for that. And overall, thank you so much for all of your presentations, our presenters, Angie, Jeffreen, and Javier. You guys did such a great job. And so we've come to the end of our session, 8 minutes past the hour, but we are at the end. So thank you. Today's presentation has been recorded. We'll be sending you a link to the recording file and the presentation slides in the next few days. And we do invite you to take a brief survey that we'll share immediately following the webinar. Please, please, please take the survey. We want to know what you thought. We want to know what questions you still have. So please be sure to take the survey. And we also included the contact information of the presenters on this last slide. This will be included in the PDF if you have further questions that you want to direct to them. But thank you so much for coming. We hope you have a great day. Please stay safe. Please stay healthy. And we'll catch you next time. Thank you. Goodbye.